Bill and Sandra, when things like this are happening, it seems everyone starts to look up, like my crew and I have been here in Mendham recording this.
Have you ever seen a UFO land on Earth? 13 years ago, something strange was seen in New Mexico, and no one has been able to explain it. A large round object was flying across the sky. It had no wings, no engine, and there was no smoke or sound. A person who saw it took a video of the object while it was flying. In the video, the object moves through the sky quietly and smoothly. Then it suddenly stops and hovers in one place, almost like it was about to land. The video ends there, and that's all we know. Since then, no one has been able to explain what it was. There were no reports from the government or scientists to tell people what they saw. Some think it might have been a secret aircraft, while others believe it could have been a UFO. Even after 13 years, people still wonder about that day. The video has confused many and has become part of New Mexico's long history with strange sky sightings. The truth about what really happened still hasn't come out. What do you think it was? Now let's turn our attention to another UFO and alien abduction story that will leave you stunned. It was November 30th, 1989, in Manhattan, New York City. That night, Linda was asleep in her 12th-story apartment. She was about to experience what would later be known as one of the most talked-about alien abduction cases, called the Manhattan Transfer Abduction. At the time, she went by the name Linda Cortile, though she later changed it to Linda Napolitano. Shortly after 3 a.m., Linda was lying in bed when she started to feel a strange numbness in her feet. The feeling slowly moved up her body. When she opened her eyes, she saw a pale figure with a large round head and big black eyes standing near her bed. A second figure came out from behind the curtains, followed by several more, about 4 or 5 in total. They moved toward her silently. She tried to call out to her husband, who was asleep next to her, but he didn't wake up. The numbness had spread to her neck, and she couldn't move. She tried to scream again, but this time she heard a voice in her head telling her to be quiet. Then she found herself floating above her bed. The beings surrounded her as she floated from the bedroom to the living room, then through the window and the safety bars outside. A bright blue light surrounded them as they hovered outside her apartment. She was taken into a saucer-shaped craft. Inside, she was led down a hallway lined with benches. As they passed various rooms, doors slid open and shut. The beings spoke to each other, but their language made no sense to her. She was then brought into a well-lit room with a long table. This triggered panic. She began to shout in her mind, and the beings seemed to understand. One of them put a hand over her mouth and inserted a long medical tool into her right nostril. Another being gently touched her hair and placed a hand on her cheek. When she asked why she was there, one of them said, "Just for a visit." Suddenly, she could move again. She sat up and heard a loud noise. She was back in her bed. Her husband was still asleep and unresponsive. She ran to her children's room. Her sons wouldn't wake up either. She tried to shake her youngest, Johnny, but got no response. Bud Hopkins was one of the most active UFO investigators during that time. In the 1980s, he began publishing books about alien encounters. His first book, Missing Time, came out in 1981. His second, Intruders, The Incredible Visitations at Copley Woods, continued his research. Hopkins's work gained more attention after he received a photo from a woman named Kathy Davis in Indianapolis. She claimed a ring and strip of dead grass had appeared in her yard after she saw a UFO nearby. She also mentioned that both she and her mother had identical scars, though they didn't recall any incident or surgery that might explain them. Later, under hypnosis, Kathy remembered not only that night, but also several other encounters. She recalled finding a bump near her nose 13 years earlier. A doctor had said it looked like a surgical scar, even though she had never had surgery. Things took another turn with the arrival of two men known only as Richard and Dan. These men claimed to be security officers and witnesses to Linda's abduction. Hopkins never met them in person. He only knew about them through letters and audio tapes they sent. The two men said they couldn't forget what they saw and struggled with guilt. In their letter, they wondered if Linda was even real or just a memory their minds had created. If she was real, they wanted to find her. They said they'd reach out again with more information if they decided to move forward. Hopkins recognized the woman they described. She had been attending his support group meetings. It was Linda Napolitano. This was the first time Hopkins had confirmation of the same event from multiple sources. About 2 weeks later, Linda called Hopkins in distress. She said two men, Richard and Dan, had shown up at her apartment. It was around 11 p.m. when she heard a knock on the door. Through the peephole, she saw two men in dark suits. They identified themselves as detectives. She let them in. According to Linda, Richard was kind but nervous, while Dan kept his distance. At one point, Richard appeared close to tears. Linda told them everything, including how her husband and kids had slept so deeply she couldn't wake them for hours. She asked the men to contact Bud Hopkins, but they refused, saying they weren't comfortable with that. After they left, Linda thought it was all behind her, until Hopkins got another letter. This time, it came with an audio tape. It was from Dan and Richard. On the tape, Richard was speaking alone. He described what happened the night Linda was taken. "I'm very disoriented and embarrassed," he said. He hoped the recording would help Bud, even though he wasn't ready to speak publicly. Richard described seeing Linda's pale, blank face and the three figures guiding her into the craft. Both men were struggling to make sense of what they had seen. Richard was doing better than Dan. Dan was having a harder time. A few weeks later, Dan sent Hopkins a letter. He was angry, scared, and ashamed. To deal with it, he admitted to secretly watching Linda. He knew she wouldn't be okay with it, but seeing her made the situation feel more real to him. Still, it didn't help. It only made him feel worse. Linda, on her end, noticed a white van parked near her building. She had a strong feeling that someone was watching her. The November event stayed with them the most. Seeing a young woman taken like that was too much. They didn't know what would happen to her or how they could help. They both had trouble sleeping. Nightmares were common. They kept their guns nearby at night, thinking that if Linda could be taken, so could they. They felt Hopkins needed their support to back up others who had been through something similar. But they also believed that two people alone weren't enough to figure this out. They warned Hopkins to be careful with any physical evidence. They thought someone might be hiding the truth. Dan's letter ended with a thank you for Hopkins's time. That's when Hopkins decided to look for Richard and Dan. He went around the city, visiting precincts and putting up flyers, but no one responded. That's when Hopkins realized that Richard and Dan weren't police officers. He didn't tell Linda about this right away. He wanted to find out more first. A few weeks later, Hopkins received another letter. It said there was more to the story. A third person, someone involved in the November 1989 event, had given them permission to share new details. That person turned out to be Javier Pérez de Cuellar, the Secretary General of the United Nations. Richard and Dan weren't cops. They were working security for him. They were driving him to the downtown heliport when their car stalled near Linda's building. All three of them saw the incident. De Cuellar wanted to stay anonymous, so Richard and Dan pretended to be officers. He was glad to hear that Linda was safe, but didn't want any more involvement. Richard and Dan, however, were still dealing with their emotions. A few weeks later, Linda ran into Richard while heading to the supermarket. He invited her to talk in a nearby luxury car. She said no and invited him to her apartment instead. That evening, Richard came back and asked again. When she refused, he grabbed her. With Dan's help, they forced her into the car. They questioned her during the ride, accusing her of working for either the government or the aliens. Linda denied it. When she started crying, Dan told her to take off her shoes so he could check her feet. She felt humiliated, but she went along because she didn't want to be forced. After nearly 4 hours of non-stop questioning, they brought her back to her building, Knickerboche Village, near Catherine Slip and Cherry. Richard apologized for what they had done. He said there was no excuse but blamed it on the stress they were under. It turned out that Richard, Dan, and Secretary General de Cuellar all shared a memory of what happened, which had recently resurfaced. After the UFO vanished into the river, they ended up on a beach where they saw Linda and 3 extraterrestrials digging in the sand. They could hear them speaking in a language they didn't understand. When Linda and the aliens walked toward them, Linda, with a blank expression, held up a dead fish and said, "Look and see what you've done." One of the aliens called her the Lady of the Sands. In a letter, Dan wrote that they suspected Linda was hiding something when they questioned her back in April. Maybe she was scared or didn't trust them. They were led to believe she was the Lady of the Sands, but they still didn't know what that meant or who she really was. Dan admitted he was frustrated with Linda and said that even if she flew to the moon, it still wouldn't be far enough away from him. Still, he thought about having a real conversation with her, even though he believed she wouldn't agree to it. He asked Bud to prepare Linda for a visit and stressed that they didn't kill the fish. Later, he hypnotized her to see if she could remember anything. Under hypnosis, Linda said they were collecting sand samples to find out why the fish were dying. She remembered being called the Lady of the Sands, but didn't know what it meant. On October 15th, Dan acted alone, and in broad daylight grabbed Linda and forced her into his car. He drove for a while, pulled over, and whispered to her, calling her a half-breed. He kissed her face repeatedly and kept grabbing her knee. They reached a beach house on Long Island. Dan told her to relax while he made coffee. Linda looked for a phone or anything with information, but found only 2 framed photos. One of her saying goodbye to her son Johnny, and the other of her near a lighthouse. Dan came back with a gift-wrapped box containing a necklace. He told her to wear it. She refused at first, but offered to wear it over her clothes when she saw the look on his face. He accepted that. Then Dan went pale, fell to his knees, and cried, saying, "It was you, Lady of the Sands." Linda ran toward the beach. Dan chased her and attacked her, but Richard showed up and stopped him. Investigators George Hansen, Richard Butler, and Joseph Steele looked into the story. They interviewed Linda and did their own research. They said they found problems with the story. First, Linda is the only person who directly claims to have seen what Richard and Dan did. The full story is told in Bud Hopkins's book Witnessed. According to it, 2 security guards who claimed to be police officers were escorting a VIP out of Manhattan in November. They said they saw a spacecraft approach an 11-story building near the Brooklyn Bridge. They saw a woman float out of a window, surrounded by 3 aliens. That woman later contacted Bud Hopkins, which is how the case began. Hopkins found other people who claimed they were stuck in traffic on the Brooklyn Bridge at the time. They said the power went out, and they saw a woman flying out of the window into the craft. Both the woman who said she was abducted and the two security guards gave similar accounts. There are also audio tapes that were sent to Bud and others. Janet Kimball, a woman whose car stalled on the bridge, spoke with Bud. But a handwriting analysis later showed that her letter matched Linda's handwriting. Linda also said her cousin Connie had been present during a kidnapping attempt. But when Bud tried to contact Connie, he believed Linda was pretending to be her on the phone. The story also mentions a meeting between Bud and a man named Secretary General Deck at O'Hare Airport. No one else witnessed it. Deck's team said he was at home asleep that night and denied any involvement. One problem with Linda's story is that she never reported the kidnappings, attacks, or near-death situations to the police. She said she was afraid for her safety and her family's. Bud still urged her to go to the authorities, but she didn't. When Linda and her husband Steve were interviewed, Steve didn't say much and struggled to answer most questions. Linda often stepped in to help him. Steve left the interview early even though Linda asked him to stay. Their marriage eventually ended, but it's unclear if the events played a role in that. Linda developed a strong interest in aliens and UFOs, and she contacted Bud Hopkins shortly after reading his book Intruders. This timing has led some people to think that her story may have been influenced by science fiction. A few months before she reached out to Bud, a sci-fi novel called Eyes was published. It shares several similarities with Linda's account. Skeptics often bring up how visible Linda's building is from the New York Post's loading dock at around 3 a.m. That area is usually busy with workers loading trucks, yet no one ever reported seeing a UFO or anything strange. However, the only person investigators interviewed was the manager. He spends most of his shift inside an office that doesn't even face Linda's apartment. Also, from Linda's own building's loading zone, her apartment isn't visible. Bud Hopkins says Linda's story stayed the same for 10 years. But some people who attended her talks at conventions say otherwise. They noticed changes in the details over time. At first, Linda claimed she would receive half of the profits from book sales or any future movie deals tied to her story. Later, she retracted that statement and admitted to lying, although she said she did get a small percentage. In reality, she received somewhere between 15 and 25% of the profits from books, movies, or related projects. If Linda made this all up, she involved a lot of people along the way. Bud collected multiple witness statements, both audio and video, and others have confirmed these testimonies. But Linda has also made claims that many find hard to believe. These include being abducted along with mafia boss John Gotti, being part alien, having immortal red blood cells, being related to Joan of Arc, singing professionally in a famous pop band, meeting Cardinal O'Connor, having a private audience with the Pope, and being in the World Trade Center during 9/11. Bud knew about many of these statements, but left them out of his book. Some believe he did this to avoid upsetting someone like Gotti. Supporters of Bud Hopkins think of him as a good investigator, but others say he lacked neutrality. He tended to interview and hypnotize people whose stories supported his belief in alien abductions. Even his wife Carol mentioned that Bud focused more on building the story than uncovering facts. He often got defensive or angry when his work was questioned. Still, Bud was also known for being kind and empathetic. He held weekly support group meetings for people who believed they were abducted by aliens. His genuine desire to help sometimes made him an easy target for manipulation. Linda's motivation is still up for debate. Was she after attention or money? She went from being a housewife to a well-known name in the UFO community, a role she seemed to enjoy. Even after 3 decades, no one has stepped forward to say the story was fake. So, the question still stands. Do you believe Linda or not? The whole narrative relies heavily on her testimony, forcing people to either accept it or reject it outright. Let us know what you think in the comments. Is this a complete fabrication, or could it be the biggest UFO story ever? Thanks for watching.